turn to our speaker of today. As background, I'd like you to all remember that our last talk was on urbanism and urbanization in Taiwan, with special reference to the city of Taipei. What we're having here now, in all of these lectures now, and especially this, the one that we're having today, and it represents different dimensions than the one that we had last week as well, represent different dimensions of what we might call Taiwan's march into modernity. And this is, of course, the massive transition which is, in a sense, at stake in this course. The transformation of Taiwan from an agricultural, colonial or semi-colonial outback into one of the more advanced societies, avant-garde societies in the world today. And certainly our discussion that we're going to have this afternoon will shed much light on this. So, our speaker, and we're very happy to have as our speaker, Professor Ya-chen, who is Associate Professor of Foreign Languages and Literature and the Director of the Chinese Language Program at Clark University. Having said that, Professor Chen is no stranger to New York. She taught at the City University of New York for I think 2 years, was it? Before moving to Clark, is that right? 2 years. 3 years. And not only that, but she also took her MA right here at Columbia University. So we welcome Professor Chandler. We really say welcome back. There's much more that can be said, and in fact, Professor Rubinstein is going to say it, because I now will ask Professor Rubinstein to introduce our speaker.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to interview an old friend. In her days at City, we worked together, and ultimately I was part of a major book on women in China/Taiwan/Hong Kong. Very well-rounded overview, and also got to know a lot of and did a reading of the manuscripts of Professor Chen's work, so I think I know it well, and it's, I'm very happy it was published. And she did me another favor. At one point in time, many years ago, 1991, I got to know Ya-chen, very famous Taiwanese author and quite powerful feminist. And we had an interesting cup of tea together, and in my mind at that time, I felt that I was in an old movie about an English rake. I'll think of the name of it in a minute, but Albert Finney was playing the part. And I won't go into great details, you can read my article about it. But it was a lot of fun meeting her then, not knowing how famous she was. Next number of years later, Professor Chen asked me to write an article about her and her work. Ya-chen, again, one of the most famous and in some ways infamous characters in modern Chinese, in modern Taiwan. And we had a long, long conversation, and as a result came an article that has appeared in a variety of works that I was very happy to do, and that the author appreciated. And it was exciting. One reads the great literature, and one appreciates it, but one doesn't think you will ever meet a Philip Roth, or I'll use my favorite man, or Richard Ford, or John Updike. And I think in many ways, knowing her work, it has an honesty, and Power Leong is very much that. But Professor Chen is also a Leong scholar of major proportions, and keeps up with it. If you've not read her work, I would start with the early stories and then shop for what I'm talking about now. So this is a person who knows feminism in a broad sense, is an expert on film, and also is an expert on modern Taiwanese literature, and has a grand scope of what she does. So it's my pleasure to introduce her.
And by the way, before Professor Chen starts speaking, she has presented the entire seminar group with some authentic Taiwan edibles, which we will now start passing down. All right, so, Professor Chen.
I'm going to talk about this monograph, and this is a brand new book published in 2011 by Cohen in London, UK. And it resulted in a lot of good book reviews, such as Innovation Studies or China Quarterly or Acacia, the Feminist Journal of Philosophy and Politics. And recently, our CUNY entire faculty colleagues also published a comparative review of it. So I'm going to briefly mention this because this is interesting. Originally speaking, the etymological origin of this Chinese character women is a creature, human being, kneeling down, kowtow to man, and then trying to present some tray of food or something to please man. So this is the etymological source of it. But right now, the conditions of women is entirely different from the etymological source of this Chinese character. And I'm going to talk about the decade of 1990s. During this decade, the most discussed three ways of Chinese feminism, for instance, I included many Chinese interviews about PRC feminism and academic survival strategies of PRC feminist scholars in many Chinese universities. In this book, I also talk about everything is actually one and just three ways of Chinese feminism. I also did feminist interviews. So there are also some examples about sociocultural impacts and strategies to culturate, Western family theories into many Chinese, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, social realities, and also some evidence in other academic journals or anthologies, and also Taiwanese food. During the 1990s, this decade, a lot of academic journals, English language academic journals, related to gender studies or Chinese studies, tend to have the kind of frequently seen, problems, which means that the so-called Chinese feminism seems to be synonymous with only many Chinese feminism. And this is why I discovered this, and in this book, I would like to highlight that the Chinese feminism is actually multidimensional and also multi-phase, and it's not just one many Chinese or one just PRC version of it. So usually when people take introductory courses about women's studies, they were exposed to the Western history of three waves of feminism, and a lot of many Chinese scholars, in terms of women's studies, they also have their own definition of their own three waves of Chinese feminism, many Chinese feminism. They believe that the first wave started in 1990 together with the May 4th movement. And the second wave, they believe it should be the establishment of CCP in 1949. And then they believe that the third wave of many Chinese feminism should start in 1995 when the United Nations had the World Women's Congress in Beijing at that time. And therefore, during the 1990s, I interviewed several feminist scholars in many Chinese areas, because this decade was the decade after the Tiananmen Square incident, and that was also the decade when mainland China started to open its door to the West after the Tiananmen Square incident, and the initial international event for mainland Chinese government to really start, stretching the arms to shake hands with the West and also the international public was actually the World Trade Congress hosted by the United Nations in Beijing. And inside of the mainland Chinese areas, I interviewed some feminist scholars in non-literary fields and some people in literary fields. I kept them anonymous, and they had only surnames. They do not have individual names. The only exception is Professor Dai Jinhua, because later I'm going to show actually a part of her video, and a part of her interview was already published by her students in Beijing University. The mainland Chinese interview part about feminist establishment and also survival strategies for mainland Chinese feminist scholars in mainland Chinese universities. They believe that all these important, gender studies issues such as one-child policy, abortion, or masculinization, so on and so forth. All China Women's Association, which is the Chinese name of Fulian, and also United Nations Force Work Women's Congress. All these are very important, influential, issues for many Chinese feminist, development during the decade of 1990s. However, many Chinese feminist scholars inside of their university structures, they did suffer in terms of their survival. For instance, the academic environment may not be very, very friendly for feminist scholars, or at that time in many Chinese university systems, there were actually no assistant professor. Even right now, not many. And during the 1980s, at that time, there were almost no assistant professors. So the whole promotion systems were not exactly the same as the current one. And the number of faculty members with PhD degrees was also limited during that decade, because it was only a little bit more than 10 years after the end of the Cultural Revolution. So everything still under the influence of the past. And all of these kind of things would influence feminist scholars' academic survival strategies inside of many Chinese university systems. A lot of junior level, beginning level, junior female feminist scholars in many Chinese universities, they mentioned that maybe they have to wait till promotion and tenure, before they can really plan themselves as feminist scholars. It means that they have to hide their research about gender or sexuality or so on, these kind of issues under disguise of maybe political studies or historian studies or different kind of studies, in order to kind of decrease the color of feminists, highlight and that kind of things, in order to secure their future promotion and tenure, and also their survival strategy, so on and so forth. And also, they mentioned a lot of fear for radical feminist activism, parades, or everything like social movement, feminist social movements on streets. These are kind of fearful things for junior level female professors to do in many Chinese university systems. And also, even amount feminist scholars in the same or different many Chinese university systems, there were also some problems of academic liberty, or whether you are really regarding me as your feminist sisters, so on and so forth. And even feminist scholars in the Chinese systems have different opinions, and they belong to different branches of many Chinese feminist thought, so on and so forth. Those kind of problems also influence that. During the same decades, for Taiwanese feminist scholars, they believe that they have also their own three waves of Taiwanese feminism. The first wave, they believe, should be the Japanese colonization era. And then the second wave, they believe, should be the nationalist party era all the way to the year 2000. And then later on, they believe that maybe the lifting of martial law all the way to the rise of the DDP. They believe that they can become their third wave. So many was actually the representative female role in the nationalist party era. However, the grassroots Taiwanese women later on have also questions whether she can really represent all the Taiwanese women, because she kind of belonged to like only Mandarin speaking, we say 外省人, like people from foreign, provinces, mainly from mainland China. I mean, there were a lot of people moving from mainland China to Taiwan around the year 1949. So all those people were considered 外省人 inside of Taiwanese society. So some grassroots people like 本省人, they spoke only Taiwanese dialect and they do not, speak so much Mandarin Chinese, so on and so forth. They have questions about whether so many can really represent all of the Taiwanese people, especially grassroots, non-Mandarin speaking Taiwanese people, or Aboriginal, tribal people, so on and so forth. So whether this person can really represent everyone and represent the Chinese development during this period, this certain period, there's no clear conclusion about it. It's still kind of disputed now. Liu Xiaoyan is another opposite role, but she kind of more can be a better representative for the grassroots non-Mandarin speaking Taiwanese women, because she was brought up in a 本省人 family in Taoyuan area, and she later on was voted to be the vice president in Taiwan. She was probably the first female, highest role with the kind of political power, very, very high level political power in Taiwan. Li Yuanzhen was another scholarly representative for grassroots Taiwanese feminist studies. And later on, after their generation, the younger generation of feminist scholars in Taiwan, they actually established their own association. It's called Taiwanese Feminist Scholars Association, TFSA. During the 1990s, the most popular issues related to Taiwanese women's and gender studies in Taiwanese university, campuses, would be the sexual harassment cases on campus, university or college level campuses in Taiwan. At that time in Hsinchu Tsinghua University campus, there was a very, very famous news report related to two female graduate students competing for one male PhD graduate student in Tsinghua University. And one of the women used royal dissolver to kill the other woman and then damage her face, after her death. And it was after the kind of serious, social problems took place in mass media, all of the Taiwanese universities started to have a series of gender studies courses at undergraduate level. And they set up some rules saying that undergraduate students from now on had to finish a certain credit of coursework related to women's and gender studies in order to avoid the repetition of this kind of, very ridiculous competition of two women, competing for only one man, that kind of things. So these incidents about different kinds of sexual harassment on Taiwanese university campuses were very, very hot, topic during the decade of 1990s. And they have also different kind of rules set up by the executive yuan, 行政院, as kind of legislation of laws and those kind of things. Curriculum also changed, and establishment of gender studies graduate programs also began in different kind of university, or college settings. Some of them have center of gender studies. Some of them have graduate program of gender studies and women's studies, so on and so forth. So in Taiwan part, I also interviewed 25 people. And some of them belong to literary fields, some of them belong to non-literary fields. I also kept only their surname and hide their personal name so that they can become anonymous. For Taiwanese feminist scholars, their worries are not exactly the same as many Chinese feminist scholars' worries during the same decade. For instance, Taiwan was colonized by Spanish, by Dutch, by Japanese, by so many foreign countries that psychologically there was a very, very long-lasting hurt that we, the colonized people in Taiwan, seem to be forever left behind all of the so-called advanced, countries, all of the colonizing countries. This is everlasting psychological hurt. Therefore, all the elites in Taiwan had a kind of tradition, it's like decades long or even century long tradition, trying to run after. They are so, keenly desiring to run after everything advanced in the Dongyang and Xiyang. Dongyang means Japan, and Xiyang means all the Western advanced countries. So even when they try to study and try to apply feminist theories or women's studies thoughts from the West or even from Japan and try to bring them into Taiwan, they believe that this is also kind of psychological reflection of their kind of colonial heart. They also felt that they were very, very keenly desiring to really run after all the feminist thoughts or feminist theories in the West or in Japan. And the acculturation of Western theories into Taiwan and try to make them suitable for Taiwanese reality and also particular kinds of Taiwanese gender problems or social problems will be their own responsibility according to, the task that they assign to themselves. During the 1990s, I believe that this proportion of female faculty members and male faculty members and different kinds of academic ranking systems in Taiwanese university systems, the problem is still the same because you can see that for male professors, if you go to the level of a full professor, most of them are men, 7 times, at least more than female full professors. For the level of associate professors, it's almost like 3 times more men than women. For the level of assistant professors, it's almost 2.6, almost 3 times more men than women. And for lecturers, the lowest level, college instructors, lecturers, it seems to be almost 1-to-1. So gender egalitarianism never really took place during that decade, unless you count only the very, very beginning low level of instructors. The higher their rankings, the more gender problems disappear. They appear, giving that, if you look at the higher level, you will see more professors, more male professors than female professors. So the feminist level, to a lot of Taiwanese interviewees, believe that for junior level, they believe that it could be a problem because if you label yourself as feminist, they do not feel very safe. So this strategy seems to be very similar to many Chinese interviewees. They kind of, like subconsciously trying to kind of hide the feminist labels before they secure their academic survival. And later on, after they were promoted to higher levels, they feel freer to show that they want to claim themselves as a true feminist scholars. And Taiwanese university system did not have any assistant professors until very late of the 1990s. For instance, in Taiwan university rules, I believe that it was around 1997 or 1998. And then the real execution of this rule about assistant professors was maybe around 1998 or 1999. So, academic survival strategies, the first part of it, almost the same in Taiwan and many Chinese cases, according to my interviewees. And gender studies, they tend to replace feminist labels. And internal conflicts with feminist faculty members also exist. So these are kind of similar things, according to my Taiwanese interviews and many Chinese interviews. In this book, I also compare two academic journals in literary fields. One is Literary and Artistic Journal, published by Beijing University. This is almost the leading literary academic journal in mainland China. The other academic literary journal I analyzed during this decade was 中外文学 Chinese and Foreign Literature, published by National Taiwan University in Taiwan. This was also kind of the leading literary academic journal in Taiwanese university settings. And I discovered that during these decades, the different academic literary journals tend to share the same preference for French feminist theories. They tend to spend a lot of time and then publish a lot of articles about French feminist theories during these decades. For instance, they talk a lot about Ya-chen, they talk a lot about Judith Deva, they talk a lot about Helena Sissu. Although they share similar kind of preference for French feminist theories during the same decade, I discovered that my interviewees believe that the reasons for their preference do not seem to be the same. For instance, my many Chinese feminist interviewees believe that maybe because of the psychological fear after the Tiananmen Square incidents 1989, a lot of people were very, very afraid of the outcome, negative outcome or political pressure from social movements. Afraid of radical social movements, including American feminist activism. Because if you compare French feminist activism, their thoughts, their activism, their gender practice, and American ones, French tends to be more like philosophical, psychological, more like inside of your mind, not so much, outside of your physical, appearance, not so much radical, activism, such as parades or, protesting, those kind of activities on the streets. For Americans, you have Susan B. Anthony, that kind of tradition to go on the street and parade and then even be put in jail, only because of the female voting, so on and so forth. These two kinds of feminists, Western feminists, theoretical branches themselves have difference. And because of this difference, a lot of many Chinese interviewees believe that their psychological fear for the negative outcome or political problems after social movement or radical movements, radical activism, would be probably the subconscious motivation for them to choose to prefer French feminist theories during that decade, particularly because this decade was right after the end of the Tiananmen Square incident in 1989. So they believe that maybe, psychologically speaking, unconsciously speaking, their choice seemed to prefer French feminist theories was kind of survival strategies, psychologically speaking, because that kind of French feminist theories, that's radical practice, that's radical social movements or activism of streets can be safer. And for Taiwanese part, they believe that probably during the same decade, their choice to prefer feminist, French feminist theories may not be exactly the same because the Tiananmen Square incident, did not influence Taiwan that much. As much as many Chinese, feminist scholars. On the contrary, Taiwanese feminist interviewees believe that maybe psychologically speaking, this is another reflection of their post-colonial, hurt because of being colonized so long by so many advanced countries in the West and also in the East. They have that kind of tradition to always, become keenly desiring to run after, whatever the latest in the West. So after they have already been running after, everything in the U.S. or from U.S. during 1970s, 1980s, something from America is no longer so new. So their psychological hurt, post-colonial psychological hurt, will drive them to look for something newer. So if something from America does not look like, so new, since we have already, done American, things for a few decades, maybe something from France could be newer, especially when it is more philosophical, more psychological, so on and so forth. And this is why during the 1970s and 1980s, there were a lot of translation and the transplants of Anglo-American feminist theories from the English-speaking areas to Taiwan. But during the 1990s, on the contrary, inside of this academic literature journal, we see a lot of introduction of French feminist theories into Taiwan. The evidence was another anthology about Western feminist theories and branches. It was published in 1996, almost the end of the middle or late part of the decade of 1990s. Inside of this anthology, the editors had a lot of chapters about French feminist theories. So, according to these kind of things, especially after our comparison and contrast between the Taiwan part and the many Chinese part, and according to the first-hand information from many Chinese interviewees and Taiwanese interviewees, their own self-analysis, so on and so forth. I would like to highlight that the Chinese feminism is actually, including many different kinds. For instance, PRC feminism, Taiwanese feminism. Every kind of Chinese feminism is different. They have their own advantages, they have their own disadvantages. And my interviewees on different parts of Chinese speaking areas, they do also highlight, their own advantages or their own disadvantages. For instance, when I interview many Chinese feminist interviewees, they were very surprised and they actually envy Taiwanese feminist scholars would have that kind of legal power to really stop all the traffic and then have parade right before the presidential palace. And they can control the green light, red light, on street during a certain period of time, like 3 hours or 5 hours, according to the application form to the government. This is something that many Chinese feminist scholars can never imagine, to be true. And it doesn't mean that Taiwanese feminist, development is perfect. Taiwanese feminist interviewees also mentioned some of their regrets and also the disadvantages of Taiwanese feminist development, so on and so forth. They were very proud of their feminist NGOs, their social movements, their institutionalization of gender studies, so on and so forth. But they regret that a lot of things were actually made up after some tragedies took place. For instance, one of my interviewees had the parade before the presidential palace, and she mentioned that Taiwanese feminist scholars should have, or activists should have more care and pressure to lawmakers in the legislation yuan about gender egalitarianism or some laws against sexual harassment on campus before all of those tragedies of sexual harassment took place on campus, or those kind of difficult news report about two women competing were only one man and killing each other. That kind of tragedy took place. As for the U.S. academic journals during that decades, I counted the number of academic journal articles, PRC, Women's Studies since 1949, and also different parts of Chinese feminism. And I do discover that even just in terms of the number of academic articles in different kind of important, prestigious academic journals, you can see that the number of academic articles related to PRC feminism since 1949 is very much bigger than the articles related to different kinds of Chinese feminism in different periods. So the problem of that period, I mean the decade of 1990s, may include the lack of non-feminist feminism. And these are some of the books about Chinese feminism that do not seem to emphasize non-feminist Chinese feminism. These are some examples of Chinese language books about Chinese feminism that do not seem to have enough chapters related to non-feminist feminism. So when I'm trying to highlight the multi-dimensional characteristics of Chinese feminism, I would like to also highlight that maybe the frequently seen misconception to equate Chinese feminism with communist feminism in PRC or just PRC feminism, may need to be modified a little bit in order to really, qualify ourselves to claim that we really understand every part of Chinese feminism and also the dimensional, multi-dimensional characteristics of Chinese feminism. So these are some of the ancient pictures about different kinds of activists in Chinese-speaking areas. And if that kind of misconception is a kind of feminist Orientalism, I hope that this book can help readers to go out of the small closet of this kind of feminist Orientalism. Meaning that I would like to highlight that Chinese feminism has actually its own diversity and also different kinds of faces and different levels. And the half sky belonging to women in Chinese-speaking areas may not be just the communist sky. It can be also Taiwanese sky, Macau sky, Hong Kong sky, Tibetan sky, or Mongolian sky, or different kind of skies. Half of them, all of the half of them should belong to different kinds of Chinese heritage group. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
For questions and discussion, would you like to take them directly?
Yeah.
Anybody? Yes, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Jenny. I'm a student in this class. I'm curious about an issue raised in the beginning of the presentation. It was about the first wave of the people's claim of the first wave of the PRC feminists. You mentioned about the female scholars in the PRC universities, and some of them were your interviewees, and they said that soon after the foundation of PRC, female scholars were trying to hide their identity of being a female artistic, like a female scholar. And my question is that because the discipline of the university at that time in PRC was introduced from Soviet Union, which is quite different from the more than scholar term to say feminism in the West. So what are they trying to hide, and what are the mainstream of the people to say feminism in PRC at that time, and how's that different from the later waves?
For instance, when I was interviewing Professor Baruch, she actually mentioned that her delay of tenure promotion in Beijing University, she believed that it resulted from two major reasons. Number one, she changed schools. She did not really stay in one university for a very, very long period of time. She jumped from here to there. This has nothing to do with gender problems. The other problem she believed would be maybe she cared very much about gender issues when she was dealing with literary studies or Chinese language cinema studies. And she believed, although there's no proof because you cannot return to the past and then, do different things to, do comparison and contrast. But she personally believed that when she was still a junior scholar, she did too much. She told too much, disclosed too much, to obvious color of feminist labels. And she believed that that was one of the problems of her, reasons of her delay of promotion and tenure.
Professor Dai is famous for his theory about that, and his scholarly study about family.
Yeah, during her anonymous interview contents,
Okay.
she believed that if she changed her mind earlier and kind of say more about literary part or cinema studies part and less about gender part or radical social feminist social movement part, she believed that maybe her promotion and tenure would not be delayed so much. But there's of course no proof. You cannot return to the past and test everything. But this was her own belief.
Yes. So can we say that because as you mentioned, the communist value about gender issue has their own kind of core value. For example, they would say that women are part of the top of the sky. So can we say that it was because Professor Dai's idea about feminism was different from the ideas of gender in terms of communist ideas? That made it hard for him to promote his ideas. I mean, because of course, even to the major value of Communist Party, gender equality is politically right. It's quite different from the tradition.
But in terms of reality, in terms of practice,
yes,
if you talk about academic style, most of the number of, if you count the number of full professors, most of them are male. If you count the number of associate professors, most of them are male. If you count assistant professors, even right now, most of them are still male. But if you count the lowest level of faculty members, their sky is really half female and half male. If you count only the gender practice of even inside of the academic, sky, which should be more, reasonable and, more scholarly and more reliable sky, because these people are the advanced people. They should, be better than, all the other regular folks. But here is the true reality. This is the cruel reality that they have to suffer inside of their Chinese academic system.
okay, so trying to sum up my question. So it's two different ways to understand that. One is that it's more about the discrimination of gender. Like if you were a female scholar, you will have fewer chances to get a tenure. And the second way to understand that is that your idea about feminism is different from the value of the Communist Party. That makes it hard for you because your statement is challenging the core value of them.
It's possible. It's very, very possible, and I would not say that this case should be limited to only women's and gender studies. We can talk about only heterosexuality. If you think about homosexuality in terms of gay studies or lesbian studies or even bisexuality, those kind of studies, they were even more discriminated than just women's studies, gender studies in heterosexuality.
Yeah, and
Male scholars who emphasize their research gay studies or lesbian studies, or even they promote research about bisexuality, don't you think that they also suffer from the same kind of problem?
They thought they were suffering from the same problem. Okay, so it's more about the issue.
And
rather
this
than
case
your
does not
research.
happen only in mainland Chinese communist society. I believe that even in Taiwan, even in the US, nobody would say that they are really free from any kind of, difficulties. And this is not just a problem of, whether you are communist or socialist or, whether you really practice democracy. It doesn't matter with political systems. It just matters with true practice. The reality is really so cruel. Thank you.
Anyone else?
I have two main points of inquiry. One is maybe related to the last question. We view the support for same-sex marriage in the feminist movements of Taiwan and China, especially when in Asia, no country has yet to legalize gay marriage.
Mhm.
And do you think we're hitting a ceiling of civil liberties where modern societies are becoming generally less and less interested in ongoing feminist movements? My second question is that since his entry into political life, Taipei City Mayor Cohen's has made a number of sexist comments that he claims as accidents. For example, he talks about the imported foreign spouses. He talks
Yeah.
about a married woman older than 30 as a national security crisis.
Yeah.
Or, for example, the beautiful lady should be a receptionist instead of a mayoral candidate. So,
Yeah,
do
and
you
he
think
is not
these-
the only example. For instance, his previous boyfriend, Shi Mingde, also, said that kind of things, similar kind of things.
So do you think these statements are truly accidents, or do they reflect the kind of continued underlying sexism among the male elites in Taiwan or Chinese-speaking societies?
There's no perfection. I mean, when you talk about gender egalitarianism, there's forever no heaven. No place is really heaven. Every place has its own problems. And this is why gender studies on and on and on. We never stop it. Because even, when the Chinese, government try to use one-child policy to stop, the population problems, but actually it created, in reality, created more sexual problems even now, right? A lot of many Chinese men do not have many Chinese women at the same age or around the same age to consider as candidates of wives. This kind of problem, don't you think that this is social problems? Related to gender, issues. After, your good intention to solve the problem of population, you actually created more gender problems. This kind of gender, policy does not really, terminate, future gender problems. It doesn't guarantee any heaven. And this happens not only in mainland China, it happens also in Hong Kong, in Macau, in Tibet, in Taiwan, even in the US.
So maybe the first question about those supporting same-sex marriage and those supporting the institution of family, and from the perspective of maybe more Confucian values being rooted in Taiwan, do you think that the same-sex movement, same-sex marriage movement influences feminism to some extent?
Yes, a lot of Hong Kong and Taiwanese women feminist scholars or gender activists, they tend to be automatically more willing to include some of the names about male scholars when I was interviewing them. They kind of mention more male names during the interviewing periods. For many Chinese feminist interviewees, some of them did also mention like Zhou Hashan, all these, men, they are not actually men, but they are more like Hong Kong male scholars, gender scholars, or they told me about Liu Dalima or Han Sui-Ming, so on and so forth. And they also mentioned about male gender scholars problems inside of the Chinese system, such as the sex museum in Beijing or in Shanghai or in Hebei, those kind of problems. It took place, or also the difficulties to have the first, vagina monologue in Shanghai and also in Beijing, but nothing took place. No difficulties for Chinese people to start their vagina monologue in, say, in the National Taiwan universe or even national Russian university or any kind of Chinese university systems, or even in Hong Kong Chinese university system, you didn't encounter so much difficulties. But it doesn't mean that Hong Kong government or Taiwan government or mainland Chinese government are perfect in terms of different kind of gender issues. I'm not talking about heterosexuality. I'm also talking about homosexuality, same-sex, or even bisexual problems, or even transsexual, transgender problems. I interviewed some of the physicians. They are medical doctors. They mentioned that Chinese parents tend to prefer their daughters to have transsexual surgery to become men, because they have sons, they have extra sons, they have less daughters, and traditionally these can match, traditional Chinese parental preference to have sons instead of daughters. See, this is also another kind of gender problems in terms of non-heterosexuality, even transgender problems for justice and even medical concerns, as well as human ethics.
Yeah, a couple things. Maybe I don't pretend I delved into feminist theory very much, but while I was working on my work on Wu Shulian and a Cohen book on women in Taiwan, I came across Bell Hooks. And to me, she's an important, perhaps neglected writer. I think she's because one of the things, if there's a difference, I realize it's a grand issue, but I have to see a difference, is that at least in the 70s and 80s, there was a radical, if you will, lesbianism within American, particularly American feminism. And it was a cutting edge. It was us forget, and the kind of demasculinization of male in a lot of ways. And as a heterosexual male, that's not threatening for a het per se, but unpleasant.
Yeah.
But what I found is that what Hooks talked about from the perspective of an African American woman was that there was a familism, an acceptance of the reality of male and female working together, the strong woman and the strong man. And as I looked at Taiwan to a degree, I always found that as something that worked well. It was not this kind of radical sensibility, and it wouldn't have worked. It was this family as well. You could be a feminist and be within family and have a role. And maybe because the people I tended to know were, people with academia, etc., that's more of what I saw. I always felt that worked better. Certainly in the upper core, the old feminists, the Wu Shulian, Chenju, and Island-Up, I can include American, were very, very different kind of women, but there was a certain sense of who they were and who they were within the recognition about the male of their time. Throwing that out is something that works and something that I found very attractive of the feminist movement. It's always problem-related. It takes into account family. It takes into account larger society in a way that somehow may not work in America.
Yeah.
So just throwing that
I
out.
totally agree with that. Yeah.
Some of this follows from this, but in a somewhat different direction. There's some interesting facts that are related to your talk, but I think these are issues that will be pursued in the week that follows as well. Number one, Taiwan has the lowest fertility rate in the world.
Yeah.
Right? It's in the world.
Yeah.
And it's neck and neck with Hong Kong.
Yeah.
And the term that was mentioned was sexism. Another term that we ought to throw into the pot is patrilineal bias, which is not the same thing as sexism at all, because it's not anti-women, it's not joking about women. It's a Weltanschauung that puts women and men in an interrelationship, but with a patrilineal bias. And the feminism that you're discussing has that bias. All right. Now, I won't say that's fine, it's there, but there's something else going on at the exact same time, which is what makes it so interesting. What you're talking about is, what you're talking about is a dimension of the raising status of women. So it doesn't make sense unless there's an overall trend, aggregate trend of upward mobility for women. There's an aggregate trend of upward mobility for women. At the same time, the continuing existence of a patrilineal bias. This is a demographically impossible situation. And the result is demographic collapse, as a matter of fact. And it's happening in, the so-called, put it in parentheses, it's happening precisely in the world's most Confucian societies. It makes perfect sense in the world, but because if you have upward mobility for women in the world's most Confucian, something has to give. And nothing is giving. And so what's giving is the demography.
Yeah.
The place where I've been doing, so this, basically you have a situation where men and women, but especially women, in part, by the way, let me make it clear, in part this is a global trend, but in part it isn't. The part that's global is the fact that people postponing marriage because of professional reasons, to advance their careers, or people wanting to have very few children because it's just too expensive to have children. That's global. And it's counteracted in governments which have policies geared specifically to counteracting that. That is, they give men and women a maternity leave. Men and women get maternity leave and all sorts of things. But that's the only way to counteract it. But on top of the global trend, you have Confucianism, which is not global, it's East Asian. And that Confucianism in this context is a demographically impossible combination.
Yeah.
And so the population is collapsing. And so we can talk about sexism for here the kingdom come, but the real issue is how to put this whole thing together in terms of a societal reconditioning. For example, where I do research in Myron, in Southern Taiwan, last year, 1/4 of all births were non-Taiwanese mothers
Yeah.
in Taiwan.
Yeah.
And where are they coming from? They're coming from
Indonesia,
Indonesia,
Vietnam,
the boondocks of China.
Yes.
And they're coming because Taiwan's a very prosperous country.
Yeah.
And so it attracts the kind of people that are needed. But the advent of these of such a large foreign population it may in fact be the beginning point of a new set of problems of social issues with their children. But again, I just want to say that I think that this whole discussion of gender, of sexuality, of discrimination, has to be viewed in the context of mutually contradictory circumstances,
Yeah.
grinding against each other,
Yeah.
and without there being a resolution. For example, for many women, it's not just the men; it's also their mothers-in-law. They don't want to marry into a situation where the patrilineal bias gives the mother-in-law domination.
Yeah.
All right? So it's really a complicated business, and I think I'm delighted that through your talk we can begin to enter into this. And I think it's one of the real crucial issues. And in a sense, Taiwan here is a kind of a social laboratory I mean, I said at the beginning of introducing you that Taiwan's an avant-garde society. Well, this problem is extremely avant-garde.
Yeah.
It's extremely avant-garde to have old bedrock conservative Confucianism be involved in the demographic crisis precisely because it's old and bedrock, and precisely because it cannot stop change is percolating at a broader level, but it doesn't go away either.
Yeah.
And it just doesn't work. And I think this is an interesting thing that I would hope that, which you aren't doing, but it's something that you should all keep in mind here, because in terms of social phenomenon and social dynamic, this is one of the crushing issues that's going on now. And to a lesser extent, you have it in Korea, in Japan. In China, the ironies are too many to describe. On the one hand, you had this anti-Confucianism wave, but that hardly had a demographic impact. And also you have this one-child policy.
Yeah.
And now they're beginning to, and now the chickens are coming home to roost because there's a demographic problem there. And the irony there is that this is a state-induced demographic problem, which is now beginning to catch up with the other demographic problem, which is moving around the corner in China too. And in places like Shanghai, they're trying to encourage people who are allowed by law to have 2 children to have 2 children. They're not having them.
Yeah.
So that there's kind of if in Taiwan it's the old patrilineal Confucian bias working against the trend, the massive social change. In China, it's the old communist bias on top of the Confucian bias, working on top of many other kinds of biases, the whole pile of them, working against some of the issues that you discussed. So in an interesting way, your characterization of certain feminist issues in China and in Taiwan as being quite similar is very interesting, because these are the issues that are cutting it in one direction.
Yeah.
And insofar as they're representative of trends beyond academia, say of the middle class or of urbanization and so on, insofar as that's the case, well then, you're dealing with a situation whereby all the various changes and policies of the regime are not going to resolve the kind of dilemma that I think the East Asian societies, especially Taiwan, Hong Kong, and China, are in now.
Yeah. Inside of this research, I discovered that a lot of Hong Kong interviews told me that during the 1990s decade, they were too much worried about the colonial issue, meaning, they were supposed to return from the UK to China, right? In 1997, they were too worried about that to deal with any transfer of Western feminist theories during that decade. And they were even too busy worrying about all these things, returning to China, returning to communist system, so on and so forth, and then abandoning all these British, legacy in terms of economic, advances, so on and so forth, and the kind of freedom, free market, so on and so forth. They were even too busy to, deal with colonial feminist theories. If you check if you check their prestigious academic journals during that decade, there were even very, very few number of academic articles. And that was colonial, feminist theories. While Taiwan was also influenced by post-colonial problems, Hong Kong was also influenced by post-colonial problems. They have different kind of symptoms. It's very interesting.
Other questions? Yeah.
Would you consider Singaporean feminism part of Chinese feminism or the whole thing?
Do you mean Chinese heritage people in Singapore? Because Singapore is a multiracial society, right? You have Indonesian people, you have Malaysian heritage people, and Chinese heritage people are only a part of Singapore, problem. So the Chinese heritage part of Singapore problem during that decade, it's a very good idea. Maybe we can do some comparison contrast during the decade of 1990s. One of my Taiwanese feminist scholars, interviewees, told me that I should probably do this for not only the decade of 1990s, because most of my interviews were finished in the year 2002 or 2004, because they were very close to the decade of 1990s, meaning that the interviewees' memory are the freshest memories. I don't want to wait till 2012 or 2010. I can update my interviews till all the way till the year 2010, 2012, but the memories of my interviewees would not be very fresh. This is kind of my response to Professor Joyce Gell's review of this book. She questioned whether I do not, update the interviews. But actually, one of my Taiwanese interviewees suggested that maybe I should do another book about the decade of 2000, and then another book about the decade of 2010s, and then compare different decades. And therefore, maybe I can save my interviews of the year 2012 to the questions about only the decade of 2000, so on and so forth. And we can later on do a series of comparison and contrast and see the difference and trace the difference. That will be another kind of interesting historical research.
And you have a model in the film Boardroom.
Yeah.
Where that film was made over 12 years, every
Yeah.
year the same group of people.
Yeah.
Now that's a
Yeah.
very selected
Yeah.
sample, but it produced a masterpiece.
Mhm.
I think there's a British filmmaker who's done the same thing.
Yeah,
Every
yeah.
7 years or so, he looks at the same group of people. It's a limited sample, but it's over time and produces you know, in terms of movie terms, a wonderful piece of work. One's a straight documentary, the other is a film. You know,
Yeah.
But it's a lot of work to do. I mean, can you do that? Can you go back and then re-interview? Is there any change now? How do they see that kind of stuff? That may be the way of approaching that kind of issue.
And the interesting thing is that all of my feminist interviewees, except for, the only exception was Professor Dai Jinghua, because her interview was already published. All of my Taiwanese and mainland Chinese and Hong Kong interviewees told me to keep them absolutely anonymous so that they can be safe inside of their academic, structures. See, this is another answer to the lady's question. They do not feel safe to release their names. And I can release only their surname without, any identification about who they are.
Those real surnames, or?
They are real surnames.
I know, but everyone is different. Every single one of the different surnames. So I'm wondering were those actual surnames? Or you created that simply to maintain?
Yes. I used the book of by Ya-chen.
Oh, okay,
So
all
there
right,
was
that
a
makes
list
sense,
of
yeah.
hundreds
Only one
of
John, only
surnames.
one the
Yes.
other, okay.
And according to the order of my interviewees, I have them, for instance, the first one is John, and then so she's Xiao Zhang, and the other one is Lao Zhang, so on and so forth. But Zhang is not their real surname. It's just a representative for the Zhang family. And I cannot disclose their, identification or university, names or whatever, even department names, in order to keep them safe. So, see, they have safety problems. They're really worried about their safety. Even they are already, full professors, they are worried whether they would influence their chances to be promoted to the level of chairs or deans or even super assistant in the future.
I mean, let me, I'm gonna say, well, during the first years I was in Taiwan, it goes quite a way back, but, as we're talking, some of the expressions, I can only call hostility or disdain for women in an academic setting or in a kind of a socially responsible setting were very explicit on the part of, and they would, and you got complaints about that. And what I find interesting about this, and in terms of your talk, is of course, and I just gave a whole thing about the rising status of women. But you're talking precisely upon, in those are the arenas in which the status is going up.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the grounds in which that express rising status of women.
Yeah.
And in those areas, you account this comment, you get an attitude which I think can be accurately described as sexist. But the interesting thing is to disentangle that kind of sexism precisely within the professional domain that is renegotiating the status of women overall, to identify that kind of sexism and sort of look at it and link it, but at the same time separate it from patrilineal bias. It's not the same thing. Patrilineal bias gives, assigns roles to men, assigns roles to women. It has it cloaks itself in yin-yang theory and in mutuality, whereas the professional battlefield is another ballgame. And so there are two separate issues I see in your talk, even within the confines of the professional battlefield. One is being a feminist scholar. In other words, advocating precisely that kind of an ideological, if you will, or intellectual framework for asserting the fact that women have their own interests and that women have their own professional desires, so on and so forth. And the other, but that's one domain of, but it goes beyond feminism, and articulated feminism. I mean, it goes beyond that to a more general issue of, the glass ceiling, which you have, in other words, a more general, within the middle class, within the professional domain, a more general discrimination against women. It makes no difference whether these women are feminists or bankers. It really makes no difference.
Yeah.
Is that. And I think that so I think this lends some credence to what was just said here, because insofar as you're taking a feminist attitude, as far as feminism, you are questioning. Well, I think the point you were making was that feminism, qua feminism, is it involves a whole ideological backup, which may go against orthodox Marxism, Leninism, which is what the communists. And so that's a somewhat different kettle of fish. But the distinction between women who are afraid to say they're engaged in feminist studies, they're precisely the few who've made it up at all.
Yeah, yeah.
They've made it up in that battlefield, and so there's a bit of their fear of being labeled a feminist is linked precisely to the fact that they're in that battlefield. They're in the war of the professions. And to repeat myself, I think that war of the professions, very generally speaking, in Taiwan, is being won. I think women are moving up all over the place now, and I think that obviously it's a great thing. But on the other hand, it's linked to this kind of crisis, social crisis or demographic crisis.
Yeah.
that we're talking
I'd
about.
like to do a kind of, I don't know, footnote or note. I think something else is going on, and it's in our society, you can certainly see it. It is that the places where women have made the greatest gains turns out to be those areas where men don't think those professions may be as important as they once
Yes,
were.
yes.
I mean, I think that's a basic,
Yeah.
and ironically, it turns out to be medicine.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways, it turns out to be a whole variety of field, academia to a
Yeah.
fair extent, because that's not where the money is, that's not where the real power is, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a subtle kind of play of sexism and male domination that is there, even as it seems to be women rising.
But what's the battlefield? The point is, medicine's a huge field. Now, who doesn't care that women are going into medicine? All men? No.
They're all men,
Impossible.
but in a lot of the roles, the numbers are much higher. The law is another one of those professions. So the variety of what we think of mainstream professions, women are there, but
Well,
again, men are looking at something
does that
else.
apply to universities? Because we have more women students than men students now in universities.
It may well.
Well,
If you look at Joe Brody's new book and a couple of other things, there's an overt attack on college-level education in this country. There's other ways to do it. Part of it is the debt crisis, but part of it is something else going on. It's impractical. You have the rise of the alternative education to undermine the great university system, or they don't. So that's a battle it's here now, but I wonder how long before it becomes part of the larger world issue of what you do and what's considered, how you make it, et cetera. Okay. We're
yes, so there's, what was it?
Anybody else?
I would like to introduce my CUNY retired colleague, Professor Tina Liu. She came here after my interview with her. I'm actually preparing for another book project. And inside of that book project, I would like to tell you about Chinese heritage, academic, women's academic career inside of American systems. And she actually was involved in CUNY Women Employees Coalition. Actually, they filed a lawsuit against CUNY, and the lawsuit lasted for more than 10 years. And it included her no employment problem, no tenure problem, no promotion problems, and all of them are women at the very, very low level of instructors, assistant professors. None of them at the level of full professors or administrative prestigious, high positions such as dean or university provost or university president, so on and so forth. All of these lower level female, academic people suffer, and they finally, won their lawsuits. So she was actually giving me the lawsuit document today, and even now you Google, the major name of these participants, you can still find the kind of lawsuit was hurt. And it was proven at the court. The same problem took place, not only in their era when they were still young, even now, like my peer around maybe 30s or 40s, they still suffer from almost similar practices.
Where is this coming?
Inside of the American university system.
But that's this kind of sexist discrimination, and it's hardly is hardly restricted to Taiwan.
Yeah.
But,
And it's nothing to do with communist government, you know,
Well, it has a
whatever
lot-
policy.
it could have a
Even
lot.
in the US, you still suffer the same thing.
No, but I think, but I think if ideological non-compliance is a particular issue that I think you're referring to, and that is an issue, I think, in places like China. But obviously, there are an awful lot of problems above and beyond that. Well, at any rate, are there anybody else who wants to? Excuse me, I can't hear you.
Can we see the book?
Oh,
I think the book is available in the university library.
Breaking Feminist Waves, the many dimensions of Chinese feminism. There we go.
Just to add to Professor Rubinstein's observations, we can also see that in the financial industry, many of the profit-making divisions like investment banking or asset management, they're more and more occupied by men, while the less forceful ones like human resources or marketing, they're occupied by women.
More occupied by men, or have always been occupied by men?
Oh, it's occupied by men in great numbers, and then women are increasing in the less lucrative ones like human resources and marketing. And I'm just wondering if Professor Chen research will more and more touch on the issue of political representation. Like on a global perspective, we already have the woman in power in South Korea and Germany, and emerging leaders in Taiwan and the United States. And countries around the world are taking affirmative approaches. For example, Japan's womenomics, they put women into the corporate governance or on cabinet ministries. And I think there is some controversy surrounding that in Taiwan is designated by the Constitution. There's so women quota for the legislators at large and the local government councilors. And do you think such an affirmative approach does that affirm feminism or undermine feminism's true values to become one day make women on equal standing as men without such affirmative mechanisms of protection?
I would say yes and no, because in terms of our idea, we believe that when we do this, we can, promote, people's support for women, participants inside of politics, inside of even stock market or real estate market, any kind of, jobs. However, in reality, even in film and in cinema industry, however, in reality, it depends on what kind of people you encounter and how you really practice the gender issues in your everyday life. For instance, my other monograph was talking about Chinese martial arts films of the new millennium around the year 2000. Even it was already the year 2000, should be so advanced and so, egalitarian, century. I still discovered that a lot of schools try to support female students by offering them women-only scholarship. They do not, offer financial sponsorship to men, but only to women in order to, increase the number of female filmmakers and, female important people in cinema industry. However, during the age of maybe late teens or early 20s, everything was okay. This support really works. However, after the age of late 20s or early 30s or late 30s, 40s, most of the women in patriarchal society suffer from family burdens, social pressure for you to get married, to, become pregnant, you have to take care of kids, and, prevent your kids become gangsters on the streets, so on and so forth. All of these kind of traditionally women jobs, women responsibility, will decrease the number of female filmmakers. And this is why, even now in Oscar history, more than 80 years, you have only one Oscar winning female filmmaker. This is in Hollywood, this is in America, this is already after the year 2000, you're still doing the same thing. It has nothing to do with whether you are a democratic country or communist party or socialist, Soviet, whatever. It doesn't matter. It even doesn't matter with whether Cornell University offers some special women-only scholarship for only female students in cinema studies courses. Because after their age, of marriage and pregnancy and childbearing, so on and so forth, they started to be declining in terms of their professional works. How can you abandon your family and children and then husband and then, in-laws, and then you journey to maybe Ukraine or Russia waiting for a very perfect snowing scene, maybe for 15 or 20 months? How can you do this? Which patriarchal society would allow you to do this?
That's exactly the issue.
And this is why female filmmakers can only do documentary films. And therefore your achievement is forever less than male,
I think this is very interesting because I think it's Germany that's recently passed a law saying that 30% of the members of all corporate boards have to be women. Now, is this affirmative action? In a sense, it is. But the point is, does this reflect the fact that women really aren't powerful and need affirmative action? It doesn't, because if women weren't powerful, they wouldn't be doing this. You see. In other words, affirmative action is a different route. But I think the way to understand this is that the pieces are not all together, and so things are moving in different directions. But the point is, it's the overall thrust and this whole issue of professional career as opposed to family raising. Of course, that's a big issue. And what does it take for the issue to be reflected by changes in government policy, which give men and women, say, time off for for having kids or something like that? In other words, there are ways of dealing with it. I think that to say affirmative action somehow does not imply that the power isn't there to begin with. Is not. Maybe it's better to say that affirmative action is another expression of the growing power of women. What are you being affirmative about if you don't have this pressure to begin with? Anyway.
Maybe on the elections, so if we have a plurality district where we have 10 candidates for 4 elected officers, and the 4 top candidates are all male, and the 4th candidate has 10,000 votes, a woman candidate has 9,000 votes. But by the protected quota, the woman would win the election, and the man who received more votes would lose the election because of this mechanism. And I think that concerns the issue of the fairness or equity in political representation, because maybe we vote not because of gender, we vote for the policies or the issues at hand, and because of feminist protection, that a candidate that people support and vote for would not win. I think that somewhat involves the debate of affirmative action, whether that should be so relevant today in an age where the civil liberties of women have expanded and proliferated so much that it's generally respected by society.
Before I came here, I was in these 2 professors' office and I chatted with them. I told them that the University of British Columbia Press, their prestigious academic journal entitled Pacific Affairs, invited me to review. They showed us for other books actually political science scholar at the University of Taipei in Canada. I was reviewing this book from perspective of women's studies because I'm not an expert of political science. However, Professor Rubinstein is an expert about historian from historian perspective. I will ask the question: if historian had never really give up her chances of marriage and regular marital life and children, all of these traditionally, defined to be women and wife job, which traditional style mother-in-law would accept such kind of daughter-in-law in jail for so many years with cancer and also all these political problems and people's blame and criticism of her, in back of her, in front of her, all the way, even after she finished her job as a vice president in Taiwan. Which kind of traditional style mother-in-law in Chinese society would welcome this kind of daughter-in-law?
Well, there are a lot of things there, but I would say what I know of her is that early on there was she writes about it, there was a failed love affair.
Yeah.
And that, had horrible results. But the other side of it is if I take her word, and I've read all of the interviews with Hyland that became,
Yeah.
I think, the core of that book and the core of later books, is that she came out of an incredibly supportive family. The brothers, all the way through to allow her to be different anyway.
Yeah.
She had a particular track.
Do you think that she has a very good chance to have equally support from a traditional style mother-in-law? Traditional style
I-
Chinese family?
I guess not, but that's not, but, history is as much luck as anything else,
Yeah.
or statistical probability. And the dynamics of who she was play into it in ways. And that's the best way I can put it. I mean, I've seen her in action in various stages, and, she had to reinvent herself at a point in which her feminism was kind of now being considered somewhat of an older feminism. She became an expert politician.
Yeah.
And knew how to play that game very well. Now, this is one person, but it's a person who I think, knows a lot of things, works with people very effectively, had enough, saw enough of the West to take what she wanted from the West.
Yeah.
But that's one person. I don't know how far you can go with it, but except for the fact that in the middle of her early feminism, she got, it was like Fox TV attacking her every
Yeah.
hour
Yeah.
or something like that.
Yeah.
Which still goes on.
Yeah, during those days, she got tons of police
Right,
letters
yeah.
in front of her, in back of her, everywhere.
Right. And she battled through those kind of things. So but again, that's one person, but a very dynamic person who, was competitive all the way, sometimes in negative ways.
Getting back to this election law you referred to that gives certain advantage to women candidates in terms of voting. When did this regulation come into effect? Is it the old Chinese Constitution or what? Where did it come from? That's the question.
Protected by the 1947 ROC Constitution.
47.
In implementation, I think legislative.
Yeah, the Nationalist Party
Right,
started.
and that was implemented that the first elections in China, you did that at that time.
Right, so the plurality district, now the legislative yuan districts are majority districts, so it's one winner per district, but traditionally in the legislative districts and continues still now in the local districts. It's plurality districts, so you have multiple candidates with multiple winners.
Whose idea was it, this law?
I think probably it continues the ideology of Sun Yat-sen to have some women protected under the Constitution with human rights. That's my perspective.
Yes, please.
Your talk has more focus on the comparison between different regions of the Chinese-speaking societies, and it also approaches these issues on a more chronological way. But I wonder maybe you can also talk a little more about the differences within the region at the same time. For instance, during the 90s in Taiwan, even the most famous feminists like Zhang Xiaohong and He Chunrui, they have different approaches to issues, and also compared with earlier generations like Li Xiulian and Li Yuanzhen, yeah, they are also have very different agendas about what feminism should be like.
Yeah.
So I think there are also very important issues about the differences between the feminists at the same time in the same region.
Yes. Number one, this is probably the first book to do and to focus on, solely focus on comparison contrast on both sides of Taiwan's strait in English academic book market. And most of the book reviewers notice this. Number two, I did try to include feminist rivalry, meaning that even among Taiwanese feminist scholars, no matter whether they belong to the same generation or not, they have different opinions and they have different branches. they even fought against each other. For instance, just now I mentioned the Ya-chen feminists. They believe that so many would represent whole Taiwan, but the Ya-chen feminists in Taiwan do not think that so many. She doesn't speak any Taiwanese. She probably understands some spoken Taiwanese, but she is not a very good speaker of Taiwanese native languages, not only just Thai, but also Hakka, Tagalog, or even Aboriginal tribal languages, not to mention that. So the Ya-chen feminist scholars, during whatever generations in Taiwan history, may not think that so many will be a very perfect representation of Taiwanese feminist development, especially some of the people even criticized her that she was only a woman depending on her husband's political power. She just, regards or uses women's issues as a byproduct to promote his husband's, political authorities in Taiwan, so on and so forth. But she doesn't, and she and her husband may not be very good representative of local grassroots Taiwanese speaking people. They were considered poison them, even after her death, even after their death. So there are still different kinds of opinions inside of, different generations of Taiwanese, feminist scholars. And the same thing for many Chinese, feminist scholars. When I interviewed, like even some feminist scholars in Beijing Shoudu Shifan Daxue, they mentioned some, thoughts between different branches in many Chinese feminist scholars, and even governmental power, had also some restrictions. For instance, in her speeches related to sexuality issues, so on and so forth. They were not just one. Even inside of Greater China, they are not one. Even inside of Taiwan, they are not one. And even in Hong Kong, they have also English-speaking generation and Cantonese-speaking generation. And the third generation may be both English-speaking and Cantonese-speaking, and then maybe trying to adopt some American university systems right now because they were, they were using only British systems in the past. But right now, they have also a system of letters after adopting American university systems. And that also created problems for Hong Kong feminist scholars' survival strategies in different Hong Kong university systems. So, they are not one. None of them are one.
If there are no more questions, I'd like to thank Professor Chen once again for your talk and for listening to a very active discussion after your talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your.
Professor, do you want to add something about
No, thank you.
Chinese American female professors' problems inside of American universities?
I'm just come to listen.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Okay, thank you again.